In this video, we're going to have a look at the state of play in the domestic economy and implications for RBA policy going forward. First, just going to touch on what's happening in the housing sector, in particular looking at dwelling approvals, which have collapsed towards the end of last year, and what the chart is showing that private dwelling approvals are down around about 25% on an annual basis. That's the light blue line. The dark blue line there is private dwelling investment. That's the component that goes in the national accounts. The latest data that we have there was September, where it was still on a rising trend. The dwelling approvals tends to have about a 6-month lead on the actual dwelling investment component that goes in the national accounts. So on that basis, and we've seen these declines before of 20-25%, 2012, 2008, 9, going back to the early 2000s. And broadly, we would expect that the decline in private sector dwelling investment would be around about 10%. For this dark blue line to turn down about 12%, 10% if this recent decline in approvals is sustained. What does that mean for the overall economy? Well, the dwelling sector or dwelling investment accounts for about 6% of GDP, so that would be a 0.6% detraction from growth over the coming 12 months. So that's a significant detraction from growth. Now, if we go to have a look at the next chart. So on this next chart is just looking at the contribution to GDP from the various sectors over time. Let's just improve. That didn't really improve it. Let's just have a look at this chart on this format. So if we go to the early 90s recession, on this chart, the real GDP is shown by this red line. So there's the contraction in the overall economy. The black line is the dwelling approvals number that we were just looking at earlier on. And that was down by about 12% actually prior to the economy entering into a very deep recession. So it was an early signal. But what is quite obvious in the 1990s recession was that a lot of components of the economy were in negative territory. So just to have a look, the green bar here represents dwelling investment. So that was detracting around about 0.5%, as we were just talking about in the current episode. What's expected was detracting about 0.5% from growth on an annual basis. But we also had inventories detracting about 1.5%, and private sector investment was hit particularly hard during the recession. That was detracting around about 2%, leaving the economy relying on exports and government consumption spending, and also household consumption, which is the blue bar. But as we can see there, during the course of the recession, it basically faded to zero over that period. So a lot of things went wrong for the economy in the early 1990s. In 1995, we also had a 10% downturn in private sector dwelling investment, but the economy managed to grow by 3 to 4%. And during this period, we had very strong performance by exports, by private investment and household spending. So that kept the economy growing along quite nicely, even though the housing sector was detracting 0.5%. So I guess the message really is that while it is certainly a negative development, it's not necessarily a harbinger of a recession. So let's have a look at the most recent components. So here's GDP growth at 2.7, the black line. These are the various components. So pretty much all sectors have been contributing to growth over the past 12 months. A minor detraction by these two, but pretty much the economy nicely balanced at the moment. But as we said, these green bars are likely to shift into negative territory. The key then will be what happens to consumption spending, and also the pink bars, which is private sector investment. So let's now have a look at the relationship between dwelling approvals and consumer spending. So on this chart here, what we're having a look at is, once again, this is dwelling approvals on a 12-month basis. So there's a decline, 25% or thereabouts. And the pink line on this one is real retail turnover. So there is some relationship. It's not as tight. There have been periods when they do diverge or lag, but broadly big declines in dwelling investment such as 2012, back during the GFC, I guess 2005, the early 2000s, and going back further to the recession, more often than not, you've seen a decline in dwelling approvals. You've also seen quite weak retail sales, the more discretionary component of overall household spending. So certainly dwelling approvals will detract possibly at 0.5, 0.6% off GDP over the coming 12 months. There's a real probability of that, and also a strong likelihood that the retail sector will continue to feel the heat, dragged down along with a decline in the housing sector. So bringing this back to what matters for RBA policy, obviously the inflation target, but also what's happening in the labour market are the key variables to look at. And, you know, if we look at the performance of the labour market here in Australia, it's been very strong, was particularly strong during 2017. Started to fall away, but employment growth, this is 6-month change in employment growth, has still been around about 1.2%, which is still quite strong. We're comparing it to the past 6 or 7 years, it's been quite a solid performance. If, however, we look at the leading indicators, and these are, say, ANZ job advertisements and also the SEEK job ad series, both of those have been on a slowly declining trend over the past 6 to 12 months. And in fact, both of them are in negative territory. The ANZ job ads out last week showing negative growth of around about negative 3% or thereabouts over the past 6 months. So what does this mean for RBA policy, particularly in light of our discussion around a downturn in the dwelling investment cycle, actual activity as opposed to approvals, and how that might flow on to consumer spending, and now we're talking about how that might impact employment going forward. So if we now look at, the cash rate and periods of rising unemployment, that's obviously the key. So what we've got here is the cash rate, and then the shaded areas are the periods where unemployment rate is rising over a 6-month basis. So you can see the relationship. There's obviously short periods where unemployment might rise, even though you might be in a rising interest rate. But if we look at that in terms of an actual distribution, what you find here, just to explain, this is basically the indicator was saying unemployment rising over a 6-month basis. What is the 6-month change in the cash rate? And so unemployment is rising almost 40% of the time, 66% of the time when it is rising, the cash rate has been lower over a 6-month period. So seemingly quite a strong measure. And we can see the distribution of outcomes down below. These are the changes in cash rates given the change in unemployment. So that would be a key indicator. Obviously, if the unemployment rate starts rising, and that's what we'll be looking for. An early indicator of that, of course, as we just mentioned, is what's happening to job ads. So if job ads are less than 0 over a six-month period, so if they're going backwards as they are at the moment, then, and that's been the case 35% of the time, there's been 70% of the time we've seen cash rates actually declining. So certainly the early warning signs are there that there will be a decline in the RBA official cash rate over the period ahead. Thank you.